Welcome to the second.
Which is mine?
Everything.
It's
all for you.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome to the second of 6 lectures on the politics, economics, and philosophy of freedom. We call it Liberty-thon. It is followed at 3:30 by a discussion on the draft, and that features Mark Chaffee, Alex Reyes, and Carol Moore. This is the second time in the course of a year in which I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. He's been referred to, for better or for worse, as the guru of the libertarian movement. But I like to think of him as an extraordinary scholar, economist, historian, political philosopher, professor of economics at Polytechnic Institute of New York, the author of scores of books, articles, publications. What else could I say? He is talking today on the crisis of American foreign policy. Would you please welcome Dr. Murray Rothbard?
Thank you. Thank you very much. When we get into foreign policy, you get a peculiar area for libertarians, because it's an area where many libertarians, if not most libertarians, feel uncomfortable, feel that they don't see where libertarian principles apply to foreign policy. If that's true, it'd be kind of a peculiar hiatus, because foreign policy is extremely important, to say the least. I think, personally, that foreign policy is the single most important area for libertarian application, consideration, agitation, whatever. What's the reason for this? Well, for one thing, I think it's fairly simple. Libertarian theory basically is opposed to any kind of aggression against personal property. Okay, we were against theft, robbery, organized theft, robbery, whether it's one person doing it or half a dozen people or a group calling themselves the state. So we're opposed to this bitterly and kind of heroically and whatever. But also we believe that murder is even more important than theft. It's even worse a crime, even worse an aggression than theft is. So that mass murder is even worse of a crime than, say, OSHA or price control. and yet, libertarians who are sound on the OSHA question and sound on price control and know the history of it and the philosophy of it and the economics of it and attack it, somehow when it comes to mass murder, there's blank out, as Randy used to say. Nothing upstairs on a mass murder question, which seems more important to myself and maybe many other people than these other more narrow economic questions. So we're opposed to murder of one person or another. We're opposed to murder of a group against an individual, and we're opposed to mass murder. Okay. So that's and war is the organized expression in modern life of mass murder. It is mass murder on a giant scale. If we had a situation like in the good old days, in the 15th century or something, where one king had his retinue, most hired retinue, and they march out into the field, and the other king has his hired retinue, they march on the field on horses and everything, and they have this jousting contest, and whoever's left on the field is declared the victor, and everybody else stands on the ramparts and cheers like a football match. It really was something, and much of early warfare, not all of it, but in Renaissance Italy, for example, it was just like a football, like a Super Bowl. Hey, they're out there, you set your pants and your buttons, you cheer for the King of Parma or whatever it is, and nobody really cares. So nobody's hurt either way. Whoever wins, so what? So Parma takes over instead of the Milan or whatever. Well, them days are unfortunately gone forever. But we're trying to restore it as much as possible, libertarians, because nowadays the weapons of force wielded by the state apparatus, by the various presidents, dictators, etc., kill innocent civilians along with everybody else, along with the retinue and the generals. They kill millions of people. Innocent people trying to get out of the way and can't do it. Now we have, by the way, a presidential order, 58 or something, I forget the name of it. We're all cheered and happy to know that even if the rest of the world, even if the entire American population gets wiped out in nuclear war, the goddamn government will continue eternally. I'm sure it's a great consolation to all of us to know the president and the certain top people they're called the non-interruptibles. So that the government will not be interrupted. The non-interruptibles will be whisked away in a special. As soon as any Holocaust coming up, they'll be whisked away to secret places all over the place, and they will live eternally in bomb shelters or wherever, while the rest of us die out. So that's not we're opposed to this, okay? Opposed to mass warfare, and then so what do we do about it? So that in the sense that we've been accused of being pacifists. Not really pacifists. We don't. I mean, there's some libertarians who are pacifists, but the mainstream of the movement is not pacifist. In other words, we believe if our sister is being raped, it's legitimate to eliminate the rapist. Okay, and vice versa. We're all in favor of using violence for self-defense, but this is not self-defense. This is something very different. This is the mass murder of innocent civilians. This is nuclearizing, a huge part of the population. That's not self-defense. So we're opposed to war. We're opposed to interstate warfare. Okay. We're opposed then to the state A, or the rulers of state A, aggressing against citizens of some other state, or against their own state too. That's not warfare. That's just irregular taxation and everything else we've been dealing with. So warfare can be defined as a situation where the rulers of state A are killing and aggressing against the citizens of state B, like unfortunate victims of state B. The fact they're also killing the rulers of state B doesn't really concern me at all. I mean, that's not, it's sort of like go husband, go bear, the old joke. I don't really care if Khomeini are out there slugging it out like president of Iraq. I don't care who would win or who would lose. It's like W.C. Fields, a magnificent, my own special hero of the 20th century, was asked, W.C. Fields was asked by the Saturday Evening Post during World War II. They had a series of notables to answer the question, how would you end the war? What plan would you have to end the war? And Fields sat down very seriously. It's not supposed to be a joke on his part, but he was really an anarchistic type. He sat down and he wrote out his plan for ending the war, and they didn't publish it. They felt it was subversive, I guess it was. His plan was, you take the leaders of both sides, or all sides, in the Hollywood Bowl. You let them fight it out with sackfuls of dung. That was his plan. It was a magnificent plan. I was getting back to the old Renaissance jousting. At any rate, so we don't have that. Libertarians are trying to get back to that sort of world. That if there is a state at all, the state should be confined to a minimal situation. At least in a foreign affairs situation, the state should not be aggressing against the citizens of the other country. I mean, it's bad enough it's aggressing against the citizens of its own country. We can't eliminate that for a while yet, so we eliminate the state altogether. But at least while the state is around, while individual states are around monopolizing the territories of the world, at least they shouldn't fight with each other. Because if they fight with each other, innocent civilians of all states will get killed in the process. So this is the basic basis, the philosophic basis, the moral basis of the libertarian policy of isolationism, quote unquote, or non-intervention. It stems from the idea of trying to minimize mass murder, trying to eliminate it or minimize it. So this means that no state should aggress against people in another state. If some state does, if Iraq, say the current Iraq-Iranian situation, then every other state should stay the hell out. That's sort of a minimal situation. So if you see two countries at war, you stay out so as to minimize the process of world murder. Now, of course, this is almost impossible for the United States these days to stay out of anything. But this would be the injunction. Okay, these two countries are fighting it out. Stay out of it. This, of course, goes against the Wilsonian theories that are essentially operating our foreign policy since 1917. Namely, that if there's any war any place, the United States has got to get into it and decide, first of all, who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, and then leap in to defend the good guys. Right? This is what we've been doing essentially since 1914, since 1917. Charles Beer, the great historian, called this a policy of perpetual war for perpetual peace. In other words, waging perpetual war so as to achieve permanent peace. We've been waging a perpetual war, all right. That part of it we've been doing, but perpetual peace has been more and more elusively receding beyond the horizon. For that reason, what we're doing in this policy is you're maximizing conflict, maximizing the area of conflict. If you countries stay out of conflict, then you're at least minimizing the scale of conflict. If you leap into it, then you're maximizing it. So, another point here is that the policy then of non-intervention abroad is the libertarian analog to non-intervention at home. Just as we're trying to keep the state intervening in the economy, intervening in religion, intervening in almost anything else. You're trying to cut state power in the domestic area, so you're trying to keep the state intervening in the foreign affairs area too. By doing that, you're cutting down or cutting out mass murder. You're also cutting taxes and the draft, everything else. Because if we never went to war, or any threat of going to war, it would be very difficult to impose a draft. Then the draft only has to be philosophic, toughen up the moral fiber of America's youth. I doubt we'll be able to get away with that much anymore. The moral fiber has gone to hell anyway. So I doubt we'll be able to restore the moral fiber at this point. So, and in addition to that, in addition to these basic philosophic reasons, there's a historical reason of great importance to libertarians, namely this. One of the things, when you get to be a libertarian, one of the first things you look at are forebears of the classical liberal movement of the 18th and 19th centuries. There they were very, very strong in many countries. They were strong in the United States, they were very strong in England. They were strong in Germany and Prussia for a while, and they were strong in France, and something happened to them. What happened on the way to salvation? How do they decline? How do they disappear? How do they lose out? So when you first start interested in libertarianism, this is one of the first questions that meet you. Well, how come here we almost won and then we collapsed? And the answer stares everybody in the face if you look at it historically. And the answer is always the war question. It's always patriotism. It's always the nation state at war. This is always the thing that happens. What happens is libertarianism or classical liberalism is winning out. The state is diminishing in power and strength and everything else. And all of a sudden, bingo, there's the chance for aggrandizement of the nation state. Go out and crush France, or go out and crush so-and-so, or whatever. Or watch out for the Belgian threat. Whatever it is. Whether it's the aggrandizement of your nation state abroad, or the worrying about some mythical threat from over the hill. The people are mobilized. Half the liberals, half the classical liberals sell out and say, well, it's more important. Order is more important than liberty. Security is more important. And they sell out the nation state of the militarism, and bingo, you've had it. And this is what happened in the 19th century, country after country. And in Germany, it happened where, in Prussia, we think now Germany is sort of a united country, which is always statist. It wasn't true. In Prussia, for example, the classical liberal movement was very strong. It was winning out. And a majority in parliament. And then Bismarck's always trying to get money from parliament, because that was the basic. He was running things without parliament, so he had to get money from get taxes. And what he did was he said, we will unify the German people by blood and iron. And he starts declaring war against Austria and Denmark, et cetera, and half the liberals split and say, yes, we need a big army and big navy for the glorification of the nation state. And the classical liberals I'm talking about, get split in half, and that's the end of it. It's the finish. And the same thing happens in Britain, where the liberals start selling out to British Empire, the great cause of the British Empire, spreading the message throughout the globe. The other thing there in Britain was the crushing the Irish, which was always a policy which entranced the English people relative to how libertarian they were. And so the great Irish question would then rise up, and the liberals would split in half, and the state would take over again. At any rate, but in each case, you see patriotism, the war question take over. The United States was the same thing, the Spanish-American War, and then and crushing the Philippines in order to liberate them, and on and on. And then, of course, entering into World War I, which kills the whole business and changes the whole course of foreign affairs. So, in every situation, then you have, and also if you look at American history, if you look at it, it's a zigzag. You can't measure this, of course. We can have some sort of rough degree of measurement of the degree of liberty, how liberty is going in the world, or the degree of the state versus liberty. Right? You start off the state being very minimal. Then in the War of 1812 was a big increase in federal government statist power, like that. Then it takes about 30 years to wash out the effects of the War of 1812. To get back because of a dedicated Jacksonian movement. And we're back then, by 1840, we're back to the pre-1812 degree of statism. This is the degree of statism on the y-axis. Then bingo comes the Civil War, and that sort of does it. Then we're way up here. We never really washed that out at all, maybe a little bit. And then World War I, and then we're off. And in other words, we have a ratchet effect where every war has a huge increase in statism. And that's it. That's the occasion of statism, is increasing in war. As Randolph Bourne, the great libertarian, said in World War I, war is the health of the state. As soon as you have war, everybody's said, well, we can't have liberty during wartime, and bingo, great increase in government control and taxes and planning and everything else, and the draft, the whole business, and very little of it washes out afterward. In other words, as Madison says, and as Cato's letters say, if you start with an emergency situation with the state supposed to increase its power just in an emergency, emergency lasts forever, becomes part of the American heritage. That's it. For example, the goddamn withholding tax, which is the key to the federal income, federal power now, right? Without the withholding tax, you imagine how the average person would kick in $5,000 in one check April 15th. The whole income tax system will collapse. The withholding tax only came in during World War II. It only came in as a so-called wartime emergency measure, right, for the war effort. It was supposed to disappear after 1945. Of course, here we are. It's part of the American heritage now, right? And then even our beloved presidential candidate, the Libertarian Party, doesn't advocate repeal of the withholding tax. So, we have a little big there. All right. Well earned. So we have a situation where war is the health of the state, where we have to avoid war and mass murder, et cetera, et cetera. This is the key question, a primary question for me. So when we estimate who's the more dangerous presidential candidate, for example, it is a fiction. A libertarian presidential candidate tries to maintain the fiction, which I suppose is maybe necessary, maybe not. But all other candidates are equally bad. The libertarian candidate, and then there's half a dozen statist, actually about 13 statist candidates. Okay? But you can't really maintain that fiction. Some people are worse than others. I mean, some people, statists might be equally bad, but some statists are more equal than others. Okay? So the Ronald Reagan, even though he and many people think it's very close to the libertarian position because he claims to be in favor of tax cuts, although he really isn't. Claims to be in favor of free market, although he really isn't. He also is in favor of nuclear war. I mean, direct nuclear confrontation. To me, therefore, becoming the most dangerous candidate because if we all go up in nuclear incineration, all the rest of the more academic and maybe more interesting questions like price control or free will and determinism, all these things become pointless, right? If we're all washed away. So the war and peace question becomes the premier question to worry about. Okay, so that's part of the crisis. So far we haven't been empirical. So far we've been more or less, sort of empirical, more or less the historical and talking about philosophically. Now we come to individual states, individual governments. Now most people are caught up in the Wilsonian myth. Woodrow Wilson, in order to sell his war policy of global war and global crusading, which has been adopted by every president since then. In order to sell this, propounded the myth which most people, Americans, still believe, most libertarians believe in a different form, namely, in any conflict between governments, in any foreign policy crisis, the more dictatorial ones must be at fault. In other words, if you have country A and country B, okay, country A is more democratic, you have people voting, and more free speech, let's say freer internally. Okay? And country B is a dictatorship, okay? and very little internal freedom. People are sort of slaves of the state. If there's a conflict between them, a foreign policy conflict and a war between them, country B must be to blame. The dictatorship must be more aggressive in foreign affairs. Now this, I say, is held by most libertarians. It's also an easy way of avoiding empirical analysis of what's going on in the world. You got two countries, Ruritania and Moldavia, two hypothetical countries. Ruritania is freer domestically, and Moldavia is more tyrannical. Therefore, if there's a fight between them, Moldavia must be at fault, right? Wrong. Just so happens it ain't true. Be nice and cozy if it were true. Then we wouldn't have to read about foreign affairs. You just figure out which is more domestically tyrannical, and that's it. They're at fault. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it doesn't work that way. There are many countries which have been despotic and tyrannical internally, which have not been aggressive externally at all. Other countries which have been freer internally, which have been very aggressive, and vice versa. There's all this historical examples of all four permutations. For example, the Cambodia-Vietnam fight a year or two ago, whenever that occurred, there's no question about the fact Cambodia is more dictatorial internally. If we had to choose, a gun were pressed to our head, and we had to choose between living in Cambodia and Vietnam, I think all of us would have chosen Vietnam. Vietnam was at least slightly freer. I mean, Cambodia was an absolute monstrosity, an absolute hell on earth. Okay? People, being dragged out of hospitals in order to get to the land and things like that. Okay, if you say one whisper of criticism of anything, you're shot. Things like that. Okay, so this is so Cambodia is probably internally the worst country maybe in history, or at least in modern history. And yet Cambodia was definitely Vietnam was definitely the aggressor in this fight. Right? Vietnam launched the attack, conquered Cambodia, and so forth and so on. So that's just one example. Albania, which is only slightly less tyrannical than Cambodia, right, hasn't been aggressive at all in foreign affairs. They've been very quiet externally. Because they haven't been very strong, but other states aren't strong either. So So we have a situation where the degree of internal tyranny really has nothing to do with whether or not a country is in full foreign policy. So once we look at that situation, we have a completely. Then that means we have to then learn something about foreign affairs before we shoot our mouths off about who's at fault. Okay, in any given situation. Okay, so empirically and historically, if we look at the situation since World War I, and before it, we find out that the freer countries, quote unquote, are the ones mostly at fault in various conflicts. And in order to do that, of course, you have to sell. If you're more democratic, you have to sell the country or republic with more lying propaganda. In a sense, I mean, all governments have propaganda, but the more democratic country has to be more propagandistic, has to be more hypocritical. They have more to overcome in selling their situation. But they've been able to do it. And the amount of lies the American public has imbibed through the media is enormous. Not just about Vietnam and so forth, but all previous wars that we've been engaged in. Matter of fact, Vietnam, the lies were exposed. It was the one situation where we had a real opposition to the war in this country. So all of a sudden, the press and the media, which had been spent the last 40 years living on government handouts and just repeating them, all of a sudden became fearless, independent, muckraking observers and analysts. Something became honest. So for a couple of years, they had honesty in the media. They were able to expose the situation. But it hasn't happened very often, either before or since. So it's a problem of finding out exactly what's going on. Another thing is, among libertarians, many libertarians have this situation. Any government official says anything, immediately disbelieve, right? I mean, the head of HEW says something, yeah, liar. The head of OSHA says something, yeah, liar. If a Pentagon says something, it's believed implicitly. It's like that. Pentagon, right? So we have Pentagon says it must be true. So we have a double standard of operation among libertarians about the federal government. If anybody except the military says something, it's a pack of lies, it's statism, it's tyrannical, etc., etc. The military says it must be correct. So we have a very peculiar double standard, which, of course, is very similar to the Bismarck thing. It's part of the same syndrome. We're ready to sell out on the so-called foreign policy, a so-called threat to the nation. At any rate, empirically, which I obviously can't prove here, at the time, but empirically, the problem has been that the major war center for war before World War I was Britain and France and Tsarist Russia. Oh, Jesus.
Not be doing. It's okay. Hold on. Just okay.
And secondly, or the major war center after that has been the United States, especially after World War II, where we dispossessed the British Empire and take over the role of the old British Empire. Britain having been economically bankrupt essentially because of their imperial, they couldn't maintain an imperial venture anymore. So we have a situation where empire is very costly, especially to the taxpayer and form of inflation, etc. And so the United States was strong enough to pick up the tab. I don't know whether it's still strong enough to pick up the tab. It's getting a little weaker. The dollar is getting weaker, etc. But from 1945 to 1970, the United States was rule of the roost, lording over the whole world, and had enough money to carry us off, or enough taxpayer money for us to carry it off. It's now getting to the point where we have to sort of reconsider a little bit. You know, have this which is part of the process of reconsidering whether the government's effective at all, whether the government can do anything, whether the government's actions are really productive or they're counterproductive or whatever. So we have a situation where, since World War II, the United States is actually running the world, except for the communist bloc and other countries which break loose. They're trying to run the world. If anything happens anywhere in the world, right? Anywhere, it doesn't matter. Ruritania, which is my mentor Lily von Mises' name for an abstract country. Something happens in Ruritania, my God, the American defense perimeter is at stake. Right? King so-and-so is toppling, we gotta save him. Why? Who knows? Because he's destabilizing. The United States position almost is any change whatsoever is bad. Right? Any change, destabilizing. Even the Polish workers' strike, which is certainly heroic and inspiring action, even there the United States was really against it because it might rock the boat. We don't want the boat rocked. We're running most of the world. We don't want the boat rocked. That's essentially American foreign policy. And if most of the people of the world don't like their present regime, which is true and justifiable, means that American foreign policy is putting itself flatly against the wishes of most of the population. And we wonder why we keep losing. Basically why we keep losing, because we wind up propping up every crummy government in the world, every dictator, every unpopular government, because anything else would be destabilized, would be rocking the boat, which is, of course, the army position anyway. Never rock the boat, any bureaucracy. Don't make waves. Don't make waves for the people in power. And so we find ourselves the ally of every tin pot dictator in power, and we have to prop them up. And the tin pot dictator loses somehow loss of faith in the United States, and loss of American foreign policy, loss of jazz. So that's part of the crisis, American foreign policy. The libertarians are trying to do, should be trying to do, is to get the United States not to intervene in countries abroad, and also to try to get a nuclear disarmament agreement, because we're getting nuclear arms are proliferating. Pretty soon, 10, 15 years, every country is going to have a nuclear weapon of some sort, and nuclear weapons hang over the population of the earth like a sword of Damocles. We always get started. We just lost a damn missile somewhere. Where was it, Nebraska? Lost it. Well, it's somewhere out there. Right? And mutual disarmament, a nuclear disarmament agreement, and disarmament agreement of all weapons of mass destruction. And disarmament terminology is called disarmament down to police level, in other words, down to machine gun. Right? Is now much easier than ever was because of the satellites and everything. It's very easy to inspect. The inspection problem is virtually eliminated because it's much easier now for satellites to inspect and find out what's going on and whether there are any weapons, etc. out there. So the United States has been the main obstruction of any kind of disarmament agreement. Has been since 1955. In 1955, we kept pressing Russia to agree on a nuclear disarmament agreement. They said, well, we don't know about it, so on and so on. Finally, on May 10th, 1955, the day which would go down, the day of infamy, historic day in American history, on May 10th, 1955, Khrushchev, at these disarmament talks, says to the United States representative, okay, we agree. We agree on general complete disarmament. Let's go get it. Let's go do it. With unlimited inspection and all the rest of it. And the American reaction was, my God, things have changed. We got to suspend the talks for a few months. My God, they accepted our proposal. That's not part of the card. That wasn't considered. I think computers, there weren't any computers back then, didn't program that one. So we suspended the talks. We said, nope, sorry, the conditions have changed. And then Eisenhower comes out with his meretricious, hypocritical, evil, open skies proposal. In other words, we dropped the idea of disarmament along with inspection. And we came up with the idea of open sky, which sounds great for the average person. Open sky, why not? We want open skies. But what it really meant is that it should be unlimited inspection and no disarmament, which has virtually been the American position ever since. So at any rate, this I'll turn this over to questions now. But the thing is that's the basic things we need: a complete change in American foreign policy, back essentially to the position of the 19th century before the 1890s. Not that it was perfect then, but it was more or less on the right track, certainly rhetorically and practice, even less so, but still more or less going along that line. And so, okay, I'll turn it over now to comment, question, whatever. Questions? Yeah.
You see that if there could be a increased spiritualism to achieve our goals, people actually feel they live outside of the body. If there were spiritual survival, they wouldn't have to defend their bodies, their nations, their historically, was there a spiritual, high-level spirituality during a period in which spirit went speak on the 1800s, etc. But people have to actually be willing to confront death in order to get rid of all this. I've got my body, my wife.
I don't see the relationship between spirituality and that. It could easily work the other way. As a matter of fact, people can sign up on the nuclear bomb crew, but say, what the heck, we have to die anyway. So I I'm not willing to turn our bodies over to the state anyway. I don't see why they own our bodies and leaving us with pure spirit. So I don't see the relationship there. As far as historically, it's a mixed bag. I mean, the 17th century libertarians were mostly Christian. On the other hand, everybody was Christian in that. So by the 18th and 19th century, Christianity almost died out in the United States. So, anyway, mostly. It was a series of the founding fathers, for example. The right-wingers now say, the moral majority of people say the founding fathers were Christian. Well, baloney. Almost none of them were Christian. Only Patrick Henry and Sam Adams. They were older, the younger generation. Even George Washington wasn't Christian. What they were deists. And so they would talk about God all the time. What they meant by God was essentially the clock winder. You know, the creator who wound the clock up and wound the universe up and then left everybody alone. And that's essentially deism. And so most of the founding fathers were deists. And so Christianity only gets really revived by the 1820s and 30s with the hopped-up revival movement, which then brings it back in a big way. But at any rate, so I don't as far as, again, historically, in the 19th century, there were two kinds of, from 1820 on, from, say, 1900, even later, there were two kinds of Christianity in the United States. There was the pietists, the evangelical pietists, who were hopped-up, born-again types, which we're now quite familiar with, which I wasn't very familiar when I was growing up. And at any rate, the born-again types were status in every area. What they wanted, in the personal libertarian area, they wanted to stamp out sin by the use of the secular arm. Because they felt that every individual was responsible for not only their own salvation, but everybody else's salvation. Because if you don't work at your maximum strength to save everybody else, then you yourself will not be saved, which is a tremendous incentive to meddling in everybody's life. So their view was, they've got to go out and try to save everybody else. Because salvation meant removing the opportunities for temptation into sin. And they saw sin everywhere. Sin was maximal. Almost anything anybody does was considered sin. So the function of government was to stamp out sin, stamp out liquor in particular, and dancing and God knows what else. So then the pietists then transposed that to the more economic policy, national economic policy. So in the same way, we have to have big government in Washington to keep out cheap foreign labor, and all that sort of thing, and increase purchasing power through inflation, judicious inflation, and all the rest of it. In the meantime, that was the Whig and Republican Party. In the meantime, the Democratic Party was essentially the party of the liturgical religious groups, Catholics and High Lutherans, and their idea was that essentially you don't get saved through this process of born again, you get saved through joining the church and obeying the sacraments and so forth. And so they didn't consider the state had any real role in salvation. And what they want is to keep these jerks off our backs. Keep our liquor, keep our parochial schools, keep Sunday beer gardens and all that. And so you have, all through the 19th century, there's a constant struggle, political struggle on local and state level between the pietists who want to enforce Christian morality through the state, and the Catholics and Lutherans want to keep them off their backs. And then again, the Democratic Party extending that to national affairs and saying, look, it's these same SOBs who are trying to take away your liquor and parochial schools, also trying to take away cheap foreign products and rob your savings through inflation, et cetera, et cetera. So what you had, so I know it's not clear cut on a religious question, and certainly spirituality, as far as I can see, has not been on the net. It's an anti-statist thing.
You have problems with success treaties with other countries. I would imagine that even if the U.S. didn't decide to run nuclear in Albania and Romania and every other country, then we could still have problems by just saying we want to pool our defense capabilities to proceed over NATO. Do you have problems with that? Do you think libertarianism says defense treaties are not?
Yeah, we're opposed to. In other words, the idea is if there's a government, the argument for it, see, interestingly enough, the minimal statist libertarians, the ones that want to keep government, keep it confined to police and judges and all that, their argument is if you allow differing defense agencies within one territory, you're going to have conflicts. You have to have one monopoly state agency to defend people. But of course we don't have it. We have one monopoly state agency within each country, but we don't have it over the world. So these same minimal state libertarians then say, well, okay, you got to confine your monopoly of coercion at least to your own area, because if you get beyond that, start meddling in Belgium or something, then you have eternal conflict, because it means that other states coming in will also going to interfere, and you have a constant jurisdictional disputes between governments. So just on that basis alone, I'm in favor of confining, if we have a state at all, which I'm opposed to, since we have it, it should at least be, activity should at least be confined to its own territorial area, where, it can only oppress its own citizens and not oppress other citizens. Otherwise, I say you have eternal conflict, or constant temptation of constant conflict.
On the same
Yeah.
line of thought, if it were the case that President Carter decided to really legal status after all and wants to minimize mass murder, but he knows that if you cross the Russian border, you annihilate the population. So yeah, then leave them in because the need American troops is that minimized.
Minimize what?
I'm pretending that somehow it was known and true that American troops.
No, you see, misunderstand. I should make my position clear. And the goal of each state should not be to minimize mass murder throughout the world. The goal of each state should be to confine its own murder activities. Because I don't think the American state's policy would be to eliminate murder throughout the world. It should stop murdering itself. Right? I mean, that's the difference. In other words, I don't consider that the American government or any other government should be the carrier of moral principles. It should confine its activities to minimize its own murder. Otherwise, you have perpetual war, perpetual peace. And if we take the big Russian threat, and all these jerks out here in the United States who claim as a Russian should go out there and fight themselves, kind of get an international legion together and go into Europe, fly in there, get some voluntary Entebbe sort of thing. All right, that's what I tell you. They'll go out there with a brigade. Well, as you say, I don't think there's a Russian threat to Western Europe. But that's again an empirical question which we can get into if you want. But that's another one.
I was, in response to that, I was thinking of, he would raise the case of the Polish strikes and how heroic that is. It seems like the best American foreign policy to alleviate that situation would be to pull back from NATO. Because the main thing that the Soviets are concerned about, the Soviets do have a concern about keeping Poland on their side and keeping a buffer between their own borders. But if they have less fear of American invasion, then they have less excuse to withdraw troops from Afghanistan and so on to invade Poland. So it seems like the best thing we could do for the heroic strikers in Poland would be to reduce the American government's threat to the Polish people, which is what justifies the Polish government's oppression over the Polish people and the Soviet oppression over there.
Absolutely, no question about it. Russia has been invaded through Poland at least 3 times in the 20th century. A long history and long and short history of invasion. They're therefore concerned about another invasion. As you say, if you eliminate the American NATO threat, then the whole thing. I mean, the Russian Imperium is falling apart anyway, even with this cohesion posed by the American threat. If the American threat were eliminated, the whole damn thing would fall apart much faster. And it's pretty clear. I mean, the warmongers in the United States keep talking about Russia spreading throughout the world constantly. Russia's full. I mean, the whole communist imperialism is falling apart. China, of course, we know about. Although the right wingers, the Reaganites, took them 15 years to claim that China, to admit that China was no longer pro-Russian. You know, first for 10 years they said it's all a hoax. They're practically killing at each other's throats all the time, the Chinese-Russian border. So it took 10 years before it's not the Kremlin plot. So Yugoslavia, I hope, Western Europe, communists are falling apart. Only the Communist Party of the United States is still really devoted to Russia, and of course, they amount to nothing. And, half a dozen elderly folk over 70. So if this cohesion was imposed from the external threat, which is fairly, I mean, see, one of the problems about this whole nuclear weapons and missile system is, one of the things that scares the Russians stiff, and it scares me also, I sympathize with the position here, is that the Russians have been concentrating on so-called dirty weapons, dirty missiles. In other words, if you have your second strike thing, which is monstrous to begin with, but at least the second strike. In other words, if the idea is to deter the other guy by having a second strike capability, which will then wipe out the other guy's cities, then you have your missiles trained on the other guy's cities, right? Okay, which is what the Russians have been doing. So that we drop nuclear bombs on them, they'll wipe out New York, Washington, etc. Now, to do that, if you want to wipe out somebody else's cities, the missiles can be dirty. They can be imprecise. You don't need precision. It doesn't matter whether they drop a bomb on Greenwich Village or 42nd Street. It won't wipe out anyway. Okay? However, if you're interested in the first strike, then you're interested in knocking the other guy's missile silos out. Then you have to be very precise. You have to have a targeted thing with very precision so you hit the thing right directly. And the thing that scares me stiff is the last few years, we have been concentrating on very precise nuclear weapons, precise missiles, spending a lot of money on precision. So what's the point of precision if we don't want a first strike? We want a first strike capability. The Russians have been desperately asking for an agreement of no first nuclear strike. Neither side will have no strike. We constantly refuse to agree to this in the United States. This is our main card in the world. If we want to exercise our big stick across the world, the only thing we've got is a nuclear weapon. We haven't got a big army. We're not going to march into Russia in the infantry. So all we've got is a goddamn nuclear weapon. That's why we'll never give them up. That's why America is a major threat to world peace, and not Russia. It's one basic reason.
You mentioned a confusion libertarians tend to have on foreign policy, confusing domestic policy with foreign policy. One point adding to this confusion is that, unfortunately, in the United States and England, and perhaps in Germany too, but I'll talk about America and Great Britain, the most militaristic, the most dictatorial, the most progressive statists in regard to militarism were unfortunately, the most socialistic in domestic policy. Teddy Roosevelt with his antitrust laws, Wilson with his regulatory commission, Roosevelt with his New Deal, Kennedy with the Great Society, Carter with his stagflation and Department of Education. The most interventionist and militaristic regimes, the most fascistic regimes in a foreign policy sense, has to an American's or a British experience, personal experience, lifetime experience, has also been linked to greatly increased state power in the socialistic or communistic sense at home. And consequently, it's very, very easy for Americans to believe when they're talking about Russia, Iraq, Belgium, Germany, that, needless to say, if they're aggressive outside, they must be dictatorial at home because this is their own personal experience.
Yeah, but the personal experience has been filtered through their lives by the media. I mean, with Russia, for example, Russia's foreign policy since Lenin has been pretty pacific. I mean, we had adopted that kind of foreign policy. It's been very cautious. The basis of it has been to guard the humble and the socialist motherland, always guard their own hides to the maximum extent. The hell with the world revolution, but basically the Soviet position for Lenin. And so the principal thing is to safeguard the socialist motherland, the Russian state apparatus, and let the other
regardless of how brutal and
let the other communist party go to hell.
A virtual death camp with the Soviet Union.
Right. Well, no, it's not even. I mean, it's a very rational position from their point of view. They felt that they were surrounded by so-called capitalist states, and what they've got to do is to safeguard that situation, hope for the world revolution, and that's it. And not really commit their resources to it. For example, Stalin, after World War II, really scuffled with communists. He really dealt the death blow to the world communist movement. Hitler conquered most of Europe. Okay, so as Hitler was retreating, as Hitler's regime was falling apart, the power vacuum developed, which was filled by the guerrilla movements in these countries, France, Italy, Greece, which were guerrilla movements, mostly communists. So we could have easily had communist governments in France and Italy after the war, which would have killed NATO and everything else. Stalin told them to shut up. Stalin ordered the French and communist parties not to take over and submit themselves to a coalition headed by de Gaulle and whoever was in Italy. A couple of years later, de Gaulle knifed them, the Italian guys knifed them, and they were out. And they did this because they took orders because Russia subordinated the interests of the world communist movement to the interests of the foreign policy of the Russian nation state, which said he wanted peace with the West. He didn't want any trouble. So he scuffled, and in Greece the same similar thing happened. So it took a little bit longer because Greek communists got some A through Tito. At that time, broken.
So Stalin, if he wanted to, could have conquered Western Europe.
Yeah. Stalin could have taken over France and Italy very easily. And he didn't do it because he wanted peace with the United States almost at any price. And what he got for his pain is the Cold War inflicted on him. So, and this is part of the. Don't forget, Lenin's first foreign policy action was a magnificent appeasement treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where he sold out all of Western Russia, all Western Russian parents. Ukraine, White Russia, all surrendered to the German army. And he put it over not only every other party in Russia, but also the Bolshevik party was mostly against it. Hated it. The Bolshevik Central Committee voted like 10-1 against it, Lenin by sheer force of will and argument. This argument of the guys now finally got the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk through. But that's typical of what they were willing to do in order to get peace, peaceful foreign policy. So, and of course, Russia's expansion after World War II was solely and purely a function of the fact that Hitler would attack them on July 22nd, 1941. There's no revisionism that occurred on that. Hitler attacked Russia on July 22nd, 1941.
Yeah, but
everything
we don't know how unprovoked and dastardly the
No, it wasn't provoked at all. No, Russia. No, it wasn't a question. I mean, it was so unprovoked that he said that the Russian army was almost defenseless. Stalin had such great trust in Hitler was keeping the pact, but the army practically reduced to nothing. Hitler almost won, which they wouldn't have done if the Russian army had been beefed up to any feasible extent. And so, as a result, and that's common knowledge that Stalin was just totally. So he wasn't trying to provoke a war at all. Quite the contrary, he had deep trust in his friend Hitler's specific intentions. Hitler, unfortunately, yeah, well, sure, and plus coming to the aid of Japan, which didn't happen. But anyway,
because your expertise on how happens is disciplinary, I'd like to ask a question from the economic standpoint. Even a large number of liberals today more or less admit that the New Deal didn't actually pull the United States out of depression or the world out of the worldwide depression, but in fact World War II did. And since in fact there seems to be a lot of evidence that it was irresponsible monetary policy had a major part in causing the depression, and it's never really been adjusted. We've gone from war to war. Now they're getting farther and farther apart, but there still is this thing, that when things start to get bad, the economy can get a shot through a war. Now, that's nothing revolutionary, but what I'm wondering about is whether you feel that the real price for physical irresponsibility in pre-World War II area, if the real price has ever actually been paid, or in other words, are these wars actually have kept us from economic collapse, and if that is to any extent true, how much do you think the motivation of the wars was involved with this?
Well, I think World War II is definitely a motivation there. I mean, get us out of the depression, right? I mean, for example, we had 10 million unemployed in 1941. You draft 10 million people in the army, that cures the unemployment problem right there. Right? So I think that's definitely true. There has been some liquidation of malinvestment since then. Each recession has done some good work in eliminating malinvestment. Like the 73, 75 recession was pretty good in that sector. Eliminating a lot of the bad investments. There's still obviously a lot of unliquidated investments. Yeah, right. Obvious. So there's still a lot has to be done. I mean, whether or not the motivations for the other wars, I don't think so. Well, who knows? I'm not prepared to entertain a hypothesis. Maybe Vietnam or something.
Certainly, it is true that the more socialist presidents are also the most.
Well, one thing is that let's put it this way, look at it in reverse. Anytime, about 10, 15 years ago, they wanted to eliminate the Brooklyn Navy Yard, remember? And they said even the Pentagon types, the Brooklyn Navy Yard is obsolete, has no military function whatsoever. They couldn't eliminate it. Immediately the howl from every goddamn politician in the state. You can't do that. You eliminate 25,000 jobs and all that. And so they kept it. So I mean, if every time you create a military situation, you create a permanent parasite in your back, that's already an obvious situation. You can't demilitarize. So then what are you going to do with these people? Obviously, actually, what you do if you have a free market, such as when the World War II demobilization. After World War II, the 10 million people were absorbed very quickly. All economists predicted a big depression. There wasn't any because the economy was flexible enough. We reduced taxes then also. The economy was flexible enough to take on these people and have good jobs and all the rest of it. So the actual adjustment would take a very, very short period of time. The market adjusts very quickly to legal loans, remarkably quickly. Peter.
Do you have any comments about Clark and the foreign policy Clark white paper?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics. I've been abjured by my colleagues in the Libertarian Party that I should never criticize the party outside strict party channels. I think it's all baloney. So the foreign policy actually the structure of the Clark campaign is such that the foreign policy has not been as bad as the other areas because the structure of the Clark campaign is to pitch, to tailor the image. It's all image anyway. To tailor the image of the campaign to what the Clark people themselves call low tax liberalism. In other words, to make Tom Wicker like us. Okay? And to the extent this has succeeded, in other words, Tom Wicker likes us, and so does Anthony Lewis and the New York Times and the Washington Post and all that. So if your aim in life is to have these people like us, then I guess the aim has succeeded. That's not my aim in life. Now, so the idea is so how do you get liberals to like us? I mean, the sort of liberal image they have is young middle class liberals, sort of people who read the New York Times and write the New York Times, right? Okay. How do you get? Well, what do they like? What are they for? And what are they against? If you look down the checklist of deviations, of Clark deviations from the true correct position, every deviation conforms to this image. In other words, not what the hawker and these people are claiming, like Hawker's national campaign, right? Well, it's all bumbling. It's all it's just the heat of the campaign. Clark is speaking in St. Louis or something and says something. That's all accident. But all the accidents fit into one pattern. The accidents are never in the other direction. The accidents are all. I remember when I'm in my days in the ultra right wing, in the 40s. They used to say Eisenhower, the defensive Eisenhower, was he was a bumbler, and the right wingers used to say, "Aha!" But if he was only a bumbler, then he bumbled once in a while in a pro-American direction, not a pro-communist direction. Okay, so the bumbling is always in this direction. In other words, the bumbling is the direction of the New York Times liberal. And what's the New York Times liberal position? Well, New York Times liberal is against nuclear energy, in favor of the ERA, is in favor of the welfare state, but slightly more efficient, like a slightly lower tax welfare state. Clark people say they will not cut welfare payments at all until we achieve full employment. And what the hell does that mean? Anybody knows anything about economics knows a lot of nonsense. Never achieve full employment. So, and of course the same is immigration thing. Now we've been pounding, myself and other people have been pounding away almost hysterically the Clark campaign for a long time. We have certain marginal improvements, like we got them to not to come out against Mexican immigration. In other words, the original Clark campaign position was that they're in favor, as libertarians, this is a typical pattern of the sellout. As libertarians, of course, if this were a libertarian society, we'd be in favor of open immigration, naturally. However, since we don't live in an open and free society, we have to be realistic. So we can't have too many Mexican immigrants because they'll get on the welfare rolls. So as long as we have welfare, we can't have too many immigrants.
They did come out with the abolition of the INS.
Yeah, well, finally, after Clark's first position was that they shouldn't shoot to kill, the Border Patrol. I swear, that was his position. We shouldn't shoot to kill. I don't know what we're supposed to do. Maybe tranquilizer weapons. It's only after fanatical attack that they finally said, okay, well, the point is, the New York Times liberals only like Mexicans in Mexico. They're not so keen on Mexicans here. So this is the whole thing is tailored in this kind of position. Okay, when you get to the foreign policy, then most New York Times liberals are pretty dovish. So the sellout hasn't been too great in this area. However, the Clark white paper on foreign affairs says it's all Ravenel stuff. In other words, it's all cost-benefit analysis. The emphasis is like this. Well, West Germany and Japan are now rich enough to pay for their own weapons, pay for their own defense. Therefore, why should we pay for it? Well, I suppose it's a pretty good position. On the other hand, that's not what we've been fighting for 30 years or whatever. You know, in other words, the implication is that it's all technical. And the implication, matter of fact, explicitly, Clark said that in the 1940s and 50s it was okay to pay for West German and Japanese defense because then they weren't strong enough. It's only now that they're strong enough that we should get them off our back. So it's purely a taxpayer thing, you know, cost-benefit analysis. He's in favor of non-intervention, except he's now included Canada and Mexico in our defense perimeter. Because after all, if the Russians invade Windsor, Ontario, Detroit can only be next. And so Mexico is now part of the defense perimeter, except we can't have too many Mexicans in the country. So, and then he talks about phasing out NATO. They want to phase it out over a 10-year period.
Why not 100?
Well, why not 100? Why 10, right? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you know, it's like they used to say in Vietnam, the pro-Vietnam people at the end were saying, well, we have commitment, we have the soldiers there, it takes time to get them out. You know, and the anti-Vietnam people would say, okay, in 3 weeks, you know, you got to use your resources to get them the hell out. It would take only about 3 weeks, which it did, of course, in the end. So, as a matter of fact, on the Clark white paper, I saw the first draft of it, and he said 10 years, and when the director of communications of the Clark campaign said, why not 5? Yeah, why not 5, 8, 12? You know, what difference does it make? It's all a numbers game. So it's as I say, there's no principle there. There's nothing about mass murder. It's all this cost-benefit analysis, and it's very gradualistic. That's great.
How do you feel when encroached by opportunity?
Well, that is. That's by definition. In other words, this is what opportunism is diluting your principles in order to make the thing appeal to constituencies you claim as a constituency, like in this case, New York Times liberals.
Who are going to vote for Anderson?
That's it. See, they might like us, but they love Anderson. Yeah, I don't see why. I mean, maybe he'll get their 3 million votes for Clark. I don't know, but I don't see why. I don't know why anybody would vote for Clark. He's not a libertarian. I don't see it. I mean, when he sounds like Anderson, looks like Anderson, talks like Anderson, why would they vote for Anderson? I just don't understand it. I mean, to me, it's a sort of a peculiar kind of situation. It's truly slightly his tax cut. Okay, this is a sore point with me because on the tax question, I did not sign the white paper. The 48 economists signing the white paper. It's a rotten white paper. It's a white paper. It's true. If Reagan came out with this thing, we'd all cheer. On the other hand, this is not supposed to be Reagan. It's supposed to be a libertarian candidate. Right? So the white paper calls for a 30% revenue cut. Getting, as the Clark people point out very carefully, this is not really threatening anybody because this is only getting back to the real budget of the 62 Kennedy administration. We're not cutting the federal budget more than we're just simply getting back to Kennedy. Who the hell wants to get back to Kennedy? That's not my objective in life to get back to Jack Kennedy, right? So the idea is that this budget cut will get back to Kennedy because I stuck in my craw to begin with. And second of all, I said, well, the proponents of this policy said, well, this is only the first year after all. Then the next year we'll do such and such. What do they say about that? They say, we'll do this the first year. Then this is sort of a neo-Lafferite thing. You know about the Laffer curve. Then when we cut the 30% revenue cut, there'll be such a tremendous increase in productivity and jobs and everything. Then we won't have to worry about welfare because nobody will be on welfare. All these jobs will be created. And the people will be so happy about this that they will then clamor for further cuts. And then we will give it to them. So how long are they supposed to wait for this clamor to develop? It says unspecified clamor. So that means 1 year of 30%.
They're already clamoring.
They're damn right they're clamoring already. I'm clamoring for it all the time. So we have a 30%. So Reagan is calling for 30% tax cut over a 3-year period. Okay? And Clark is calling for 30% tax cut over a 1-year period. That's the big deal. That's what we're going to barricades for. It's true that the Reagan cut is phony and all that, but that's not the point. The point is we have not differentiated ourselves on the tax question. We're only slightly better than Reagan on the tax question. To me, it's not good enough. We're tailing behind the 6th Liberty Amendment people. These poor bastards have been calling for the repeal of the 16th Amendment now for 20 years. We dismiss that as being radical and irresponsible. And how we support the services of the federal government if we repeal the income tax, right? So that's, I mean, what we should have done is call for repeal the income tax, and also the president. This is what Berglund, the senator, called for this. Let's say Senate campaign in California. We should say as president, because one of the things that's always asked the presidential candidate is, well, what would you do? What could you do as president if the Congress is against you? I mean, it's kind of a weird question. Obviously, if Clark was really elected president, we have some libertarian congressmen also, presumably. At any rate, but even so, even within this peculiar matrix, the president could do something which cannot be challenged by any court. Right? The president has absolute power of pardon. Absolute power of pardon. Okay. So the president can announce, or Clark can announce right now, say, when I get elected president, quote, unquote, I will then immediately pardon all past, present, and future victimless crime people, including tax evasion. Okay. This would make income taxes voluntary at least for 4 years, at least if he's impeached. So he doesn't do that. Hasn't got the guts to do that. Hasn't got the guts to call for. Huh?
He did do it once.
He did?
In Colorado or someplace.
He did it.
Little tiny thing. He hasn't done it yet.
He said a few times that he wrapped up, pardoned tax evaders, and he called, I remember specifically, for removal of criminal and civil penalties.
He did.
He did quote that in front of the press.
Okay, he hasn't made that a centerpiece of the
Well, he doesn't.
white paper.
Now with white paper, he spoke to it as soon as he
Yeah, okay. Well, see, the defense of the Clark people, I've had, of course, a lot of discussions with LP members about this. The defense is, no, well, Clark was good in Des Moines on July 15th. He came out for immigration, that sort of thing. Well, and my reply to this is, it's a hell of a situation where we have to rely on the inconsistency of our candidate. That's really what it is. He's good in some places and bad in others.
And not only that, one thing that has to be mentioned, if he's willing to compromise as a candidate when he has no real pressure on him, what's going to happen when HEW starts screaming, don't cut $50 billion from my government budget? What's going to happen when the CIA reminds him of the Kennedy assassination and the Pinochet?
No, that's a good point. I mean, most ideological movements, there's always a problem of selling out in ideological movements. Most ideological movements sell out after they achieve power. They begin slow corruption begins to take place, or on the edge of achieving power, right? It's just a little bit of waffling, you can get power. But the sellout, I mean, when you have the expectation of maybe getting power in 30 years, that's kind of peculiar. That's the earliest sellout in my memory.
So, I have a question on nuclear entitlement.
Right.
I'm vague on the idea. Let's say that given that nuclear entitlement, an agreement is reached, and there's the satellite tracing, what is the step to take if, say, we find that some Central American country has developed the only nuclear weapon in the world? What happens, we can have inspection, but what happens if we catch someone violating the agreement?
Well, I'm not sure what the steps are. I'm not sure anybody's got the answer. I mean, libertarian and non-libertarian. Presumably nobody's going to develop a nuclear weapon if nobody else has it. But I admit this is a big problem. I really don't know the techniques of it. I think there's probably certain boycotts that could be done, like boycott the country, boycott plutonium or something. Yeah, I say I'm not sure about the mechanics of this thing. What do you do about inspection and all that? But I would think that if you had I mean, as I say, we're gonna have a problem more and more in the future regardless of what system you've got. And, but I think if you're not using certain materials that are needed for nuclear devices, and if they're not being used, you can sort of catch it in advance.
The inspection will start at somewhere in the production process.
Yeah. I don't know what this guy's going to be doing with it, even if he gets it. How he's going to use it. But I would think something like that. I really don't. That was really a technical question.
Just for the benefit of some non-libertarians, maybe you can illuminate the libertarian position and connections between energy and American foreign policy. The idea that we're going to go fight for oil. I mean, how do we look at that?
Well, it's a whole other topic. I mean, it's.
I know it's a whole other lecture.
It's a whole other lecture. Yeah, it's. I mean, basically, you don't have to grab. As we know from free market economy, you don't have to grab resources. You can buy it. That's the basic. You can buy oil. You have to own it yourself. So we can buy oil from countries even though if we don't like it. I mean, it's the way the market works in general. I can buy a sandwich from McDonald's, even though I might hate the McDonald's owner for some reason. There's nothing. I don't have to be a friend of McDonald's in order to like their product. It's the same way with buying oil. And so there's a lot of oil. There's a lot of energy in oil every place else, including the United States, which the American government is refusing to allow to be produced on one basis or another. So with all that, I mean, there's no real energy crisis. Because the crisis is probably of government control. We managed to design it in such a way we can use most of the land in the United States, which is taken off the market by the federal government, and Alaska. Price controls which prevent domestic oil from being produced. Price controls prevent natural gas from being produced. All sorts of restrictions prevent coal from being produced. There's a whole bunch of stuff which, if we eliminated the restrictions, would be far more. That's the quick answer.
What specific proposals would you suggest that the Libertarian Party, Pat Clark in his campaign, should argue for with regard to the United States government control of nuclear weapons?
That's Germany control nuclear weapons.
The nuclear weapons of the United States government at this moment.
I don't see. Well, Clark would argue for a so-called dyad. In other words, he's argued for we don't need land-based missiles, which are superfluous and also vulnerable. We could get a so-called triad. All we need is the submarines and the bombers always in the air. I don't see why we need the bombers. It seems to me submarines are enough, at very least. The old-style, so-called old-style submarines, Poseidon submarines, are plenty. They could kill the Russians 20 times over, and they can't be discovered on first strike. That's just the beginning.
What I had in mind, actually, was it does seem to me that libertarians are taking your line seriously about mass murder, which we should.
Right.
It seems to be very difficult for them, actually, in fact, to come out with anything other than unilateral disarmament.
No. Well, I would. I mean, since I think we could achieve multilateral disarmament, I don't see the point of unilateral. In other words, I think the Russians are willing to go along with multilateral disarmament. If I didn't think they would, I think we should seriously consider unilateral. Since they are, there's not much point to it. The pacifists, by the way, those in this country, are against the multilateral. They're in favor of unilateral and against multilateral. Somehow they think it's more moral to have unilateral disarmament. But it seems to me that if we can get the whole show, why settle for a little bit of it? Yeah. Cal.
Could you go into a little more depth on why you think is proactively propping up a lot of
Well, it's the American empire at work. I mean, it happens in every empire. You're trying to run the whole show, we want stability for investments, for resources, for all sorts of stuff, for Rockefeller, the world oil investments, all sorts of reasons, both political and economic. They both mesh in together in economic sense of propping up investments of all sorts. For example, I mean, just take one area of the economic political penetration. John Foster Dulles, one of the most evil people in American history, was Secretary of State during the Eisenhower administration. He had written in 1940 a book called War, Peace, and Change, or 39 or 40, which took a diametrically opposite view of foreign affairs than he did 10 years later in 1950. You could say, well, he's a young man, he might have changed, but he wasn't so young. He was in his 40s or 50s when he wrote War, Peace, and Change. He took a very realistic balance of power outlook toward Europe. He said, we shouldn't intervene in Europe. The Germans, many of the German demands are correct. We should have adjustments to the Versailles Treaty and so forth and so on. So he took what can be called a non-interventionist position in Europe in World War II. Then 10 years later, he takes a global crusading position. America's Christian morality demands we crush totalitarian communism throughout the world. And he takes, in other words, his whole foreign policy outlook changes drastically. Either it's possibly could have had an ideological conversion, but somehow I doubt it. It's also possible his views were influenced by the fact that he was a lawyer and also relative of the Rockefeller family and Standard Oil. His wife was the first cousin of John D. Rockefeller Jr. And he himself was a lawyer for Standard Oil and Rockefeller family. And the fact that Rockefellers were isolationists in Europe in World War II, they had no investments there, they didn't care about Europe. On the other hand, they were interventionists in Asia. They wanted to crush Japan. They wanted to get, they worried about Japanese competition for oil and rubber in Southeast Asia. On the other hand, of course, the Rockefellers were hip deep in the Cold War with the whole world oil problem. They were worried about communists taking over resources. So that's just one instance of economic interest influencing foreign policy in a very direct way. Also, by the way, his brother, the whole Dulles family line, his brother, Allen Dulles, was head of the CIA and practically was as important as shaping foreign policy, conducting assassinations everywhere and things like that. And his sister, Eleanor Lansing Dulles, was head of the Berlin desk of the State Department. We have 3 members of the same family running things. It's sort of an acme situation.
Take one more question.
You said that we might as well go for multilateral disarmament.
Yeah.
If that's possible. How is that we're not possible? So we spoke of unilateral disarmament. Secondly, should we go for unilateral disarmament in the face of expansionary power? For example, Hitler, power. What does one do then in that pragmatic situation?
Well, I think his relying on mass murder, I don't see any way out. There's no other choice. There's no possibly a multi-lateral disarmament. Actually, the American defense and guerrilla warfare will be extremely strong. In other words, we now see that more than ever that counter-guerrilla nation can't really conquer a guerrilla nation.
Japan surrendered at strike.
That's right.
The point is, Hitler had even more powerful weaponry. And so listen, in the guerrilla warfare in the U.S., I'll just keep strike there. In other words, you can defeat guerrilla warfare.
But Japan wasn't engaged in guerrilla warfare. They had a
No, before, because Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they knew they better.
no. I'm sorry. Japan was willing to sue for peace long before Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Granted, the point, almost no nation will tolerate itself being liberated by weaponry. The point that I'm making is that somebody that's warlike tension policy has it. A lot of Christian developed this kind of weapon. I can see why people want to develop this kind of weapon. If it's that leverage on getting certain kinds of territory, certain kinds of, favorable.
What territory were they? What territory were they asked for? I don't understand what were they asked? Supposing you said, were they occupy the United States? Would that be the point?
Well, they have the one to occupy the red dot.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, always have the one to occupy the red dot. Okay, and he gets some new weapons. Okay. What I'm saying is that certain people might use that.
Yeah.
So what would you say in the context now? Would you say that under any condition, it's on the lateral to minimize mass murder, which might be a valid point, and suffer to get there has to come out in the end.
I don't think there would be any point right now in occupying the United States. As I say, it would be uneconomic and also be yeah.
Suppose somebody else who did have a point of view. Yeah, not even a maniac. I treated Murray, there is a point of view.
Right.
And I'm going to make those weapons.
Right.
Would you still want me out? And you knew that. You still,
Yeah, I would. I would favor multilateral first, if not unilateral.
yeah, but I'm including multilateral, and that's impossible.
Okay, well, in that case, then they have to go for unilateral.
Even though this person's holding the
That's right.
Don't forget, even if we kept 5 hydrogen bombs, that would inflict unacceptable damage.
I'm talking about, I'm trying to get a purely principled,
Right.
you're getting rid of all, empirical conditions, I'm saying principle. You have somebody else about the weapon. In effect, you're saying, well, if he wants it, but better, not red than dead, but better alive than new.
Right.
I'd like to thank Murray Rothbard.